All right, so let's talk a little bit about how Mote can support the 5 F's of assessment. And when I'm talking about the 5 F's of assessment, I'm just talking about something that I came up with that I use to help ground me when I'm thinking about assessment. And I don't know about you, but I have found that assessment has been something that my students have been struggling with the last few years. I don't know if it's because of COVID or just because there's so much pressure on students through social media and all sorts of different things. But I find that sometimes around assessment, students freeze up and students have a lot of trouble. And so while thinking about that, I've been using different technology tools to help my students become better prepared for assessments, but I've also tailored assessments to try to help students to have a better experience when it comes to assessment. And so hello. And I want to make sure that my students feel supported and my students have opportunities to give me feedback and that I can give them feedback. So if you take nothing else away from this, strong feedback loop. That's what you need with your students in order to help them feel more supported around assessment. Because assessment is scary in sometimes. And I think it's because you really are showing what you know about something. But how do we make it so that it's not scary for students, that it's more of like a progress check-in, that it's more of a feedback? Because really the purpose of assessment is to give students feedback. And so let's dig into this just a little bit here. And so I'm going to introduce myself just quickly. I'm the Dean of Faculty and the Dean of Academic Technology and Innovative Pedagogy at the Ethel Walker School in Simsbury, Connecticut. Yay, Connecticut. I'm also a graduate instructor at Idioma Education and Consulting, where I do graduate classes on Latin pedagogy, world language pedagogy, differentiation and neurodiversity, and also on instructional technology. If you'd like to follow me on X, I think that's what we're calling it. I'm at Latin Tech Tools, and I'm also going to be on Blue Sky at Latin Tech Tools. So please welcome. I welcome feedback. I welcome messages. Like, let me know what you think. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. And so why 5 F's? Because frankly, I'm someone who remembers things if I have a little device to remember it. And so when I'm thinking about assessment, I want my assessment to have 5 elements. I want my assessments to be familiar to students. They know what to expect with the assessment, and they also know when that assessment is. I want assessment to be something that's frequent. And I know that a lot of us have many, many students. And so doing frequent assessment can seem overwhelming. It can seem daunting. However, I would argue that you don't need to necessarily do in-depth grading for every assessment. And also, when you're giving frequent feedback, you can do things like emojis, or you can use your Mote book to give different kind of voice feedback. So there's a lot of different ways you can give feedback. When I'm thinking about flexibility when it comes to feedback, I think that a lot of what it is that students need to feel like they have some sort of ownership, they have some sort of agency here in terms of what they're doing with their assessment. And so whether that's giving students choice, whether that's letting them choose how they're being assessed, what they're being assessed on, things like that, giving them some sort of flexibility. Maybe they can retake their assessment. Maybe you're giving them a pre-assessment so they can go over it first. There's a lot of different things you can do here. Focused. I would argue that when you can focus on just a few things at once, you are going to have a more reliable feedback loop of how students are doing with those particular tasks. And so then you can give them accurate feedback on their skills. So keeping it focused to maybe 1 or 2, possibly 3 skills max is something that's going to really help refine your assessments. And finally, looking at assessment is not something that's punitive, not something where students are like, oh, well, you get this grade and this is a grade you earn and that's it. No, seeing it more like a feedback loop with your teacher, something where you are getting that feedback and it can help you. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is familiar assessments. So students need to be familiar with both how they will be assessed and the material they'll be assessed on. There should be no gotcha moments. There should be no surprises. I think that when you walk in and you hear there's a pop quiz in class, all of a sudden that does something to you. That makes you feel, oh no, there's an oh no reaction. We don't want that. We don't want assessment to equal danger. We want assessment to be something where students are getting that feedback, and Mote can really help with that. And here are some of the ways that Mote can help with familiarity. First off, create a community from day one. You want your students to feel comfortable in that classroom. And so from day one, make sure you're using something so students can introduce themselves. And so what I like to do is at the beginning of the year, I give students a quick Google feedback form where they can do a Mote where they introduce themselves. They say their preferred names, their preferred pronouns if they feel comfortable doing so. And I ask them, what's one thing you want your teacher to know? And that could be anything from, I want you to know I like to sit in the front, or maybe I don't feel super comfortable doing something, or maybe I need a lot of help with this. Or it could be just, I want you to know that I really like this subject, something like that. I don't know. Just something so that you give them that opportunity to say something if they want to. And then I usually do something fun, like, and then will you tell me what your theme song would be if you had to pick a theme song for when you walked in the room? Something kind of fun like that. And so by doing that, you're creating an immediate sense of community, and Mote can be so helpful for that. When I was using Google Classroom, I would just do it right in Google Classroom. Now that I'm not, I do it in a Google form. And so really doing something where students can share right away is something that's very powerful. And also having students pronounce their own names is something that has really, really helped me. And so I think that's something that's really helpful. I see the question there. How do you create a feeling community in the beginning of the school year? And, creating community through sharing could be so, so very helpful. Another one is to do a quick summary. So maybe just a wrap up of what we did in class, rather than doing a traditional exit ticket where you're writing or answering questions. Have students summarize in their own words, give the 90-second version of what we went over in class, and then give perhaps some opportunities for students to ask questions. That way, you're getting that quick feedback from students. You're finding out what they got from class, and also, and probably more importantly, what they may have missed, or what you wanted them to focus on that maybe they didn't focus on, or maybe they have questions about something, so you know what to review next time. So using Mote to have students give a quick summary at the end of class as kind of exit ticket can be really, really helpful, and it lets you know what the students know. That way you make sure when you're assessing them on things that are familiar to them. And if they're not familiar with something, you can take that time to give them the support and scaffold it so that they do know something. This can be really helpful too when students are reviewing for an assessment. You want to make sure that they understand why they're reviewing what they're reviewing. So let's say you give them a list of resources you want them to look through. You can do some Mote comments and explain points from the relevant websites they're looking for, or the relevant documents. What is it they're looking for in this website? So you don't just pull it up and say, okay, what am I looking for? What do I have to know from this? So giving them just a quick overview can be really, really helpful. Another thing that I did not put in here that is also helpful, that doesn't have to do that much with familiarity, but definitely helps with many of my students, is creating a Mote where you just go over the directions. You just read the directions. That explanation of directions, I find, really helps students to understand what's going on. And if I do that, especially in a practice assessment, so that students know right away, okay, this is something that, okay, so as we're going over this, we know these are the directions, and then they can go back and listen to them again. That can be really helpful. I like to keep the directions the same on the practice assessment that I have on the real assessment too, because that way students will have no questions about directions. Or if they have any questions, they can do it with the practice assessment. That can be really, really helpful. I also do this for read alouds. So if there is a bit of text that we're doing, and I'm a Latin teacher, I will do a Mote where I will be speaking the Latin so that students can listen and read at the same time. I used to do this with passages too when I used to teach English. I think that can be really, really helpful to break it up into passages where students can listen. And with Mote, it's so nice because you can do the speaking yourself, or you can even have students read passages or take turns reading passages and recording their voice. However you want to do it, it's something that can be really helpful. Another thing that's really nice is that if you're creating Motes that you think will be helpful to students for their review of an assessment, you can save it to your Mote book, and then you can access it really easily and then share it again. So I think that's really, really helpful that you can share those Motes with students. And I'm going to bring up this point again and again, but my students are way more inclined in the last few years to watch or listen to something than they are to read something. So when I'm giving feedback, being able to give feedback that students can listen to, especially quick to the point feedback like Mote, is something that is very valuable and something that my students are more likely to do. And so when you're saving to Motebook, I would say it's really important to give it a name that's really helpful. Here we have Notebook is really easy, but also something where if you give a name to something, then you can find it easily. So maybe I would do something like, I'm doing this for Latin 1. I would say Latin 1, Unit 1. I would make it a very detailed Latin 1, Unit 1 explanation of blank. Make it something detailed, so make it something you can go back to. And then when you create a ton of things in Notebook, you can do them again next year. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So you're only recording all of those things once. Or if you're doing something a little differently, you can kind of tweak it. And that's really fun too. And so you can see, okay, I did this last year. Maybe I could do something different. I'll listen to that. Okay, maybe I want to modify that or refine that for the next year. Something to keep in mind. I also believe in the power of frequent assessment. Students should receive frequent formative assessments to assess understanding. That way, not only will they have an idea of where they are, you'll have an idea of where they are. Again, not all of this has to be something formal or graded, but just a way for students to get feedback in a frequent manner. One of the things I like to do is have students give a quick explanation of something on a Google form. So let's say we did some sort of concept in class and we talked about it. Then I have all students do kind of a quick explanation on Google form with Mote. So they can do a quick spoken explanation. And then I can go back and listen to those and see how they're doing. And I'll be able to give them that quick, relevant feedback. So that's something I think is really powerful. I think it's a time saver for so many different reasons, but it also allows students to let you know, okay, this is what I got from this. And that way you can do something that's more frequent, but at the same time, you can give them the relevant information. And I really like the accessibility of Mote because you can give emoji, spoken, or written feedback to what students are saying. And that's really helpful. I find that my students, they like emojis, they're fun, but just speaking and having them hear the tone of your voice and how you're saying something and giving that spoken feedback can be really helpful. But also doing something, you have a choice, which is really nice. And you can do things over and over. And like I said, I make my notebook with lots of comments. So if I'm repeating comments, I can use that too. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to record something new every time. Flexible. It's really important too, when it comes to assessment, that students have some choice in how they demonstrate their learning. And this is where Mote can come in. And so again, you can have students do emoji, spoken, or written feedback. Give students that choice of feedback. Teachers have choice of feedback and students have choice of feedback. So you can figure out what works best for that student, which is really nice. You can also give students a choice of how to be assessed. Maybe they're more comfortable writing. Maybe they're more comfortable speaking. Maybe they want to do a combination of both. Maybe they want to speak it and then go back and modify it, which you can do. You can go in and get your transcript and modify it and create something written. And that's something I actually encourage a lot of my students to do who feel more comfortable speaking. I find that sometimes if they get their ideas out there by speaking and then create a transcript for themselves, they can then modify that to become a written assessment. And it's something that is very helpful because sometimes it just feels easier to speak than to write. And especially when you have writer's block, just getting your ideas out there can be very powerful. So choice of assessment gives students that power and agency. Another thing that's helpful is when you're doing, let's say you're doing a spoken assessment, students can listen to what they did and then decide to re-record. So it's kind of a built-in reassessment here. You can give students the opportunity to try again. And that's something that's really helpful. Another thing that I strongly encourage my students to do is if they're going to do a class presentation, I strongly encourage them to record themselves speaking it in advance and then get feedback on it. That way I can hear what they're going to say, especially when I'm doing something in the target language. I can help them. I can look at their transcript for their Latin and help them to modify it. I can help them figure out what's going on there. And I can also give them feedback. I can say, okay, slow down here, or maybe you want to bring out this point more. I also do a thing with my students each year where they do a persuasive speech. And I find that this is a wonderful way for students to practice their persuasive speech and to go through and make sure they're hitting all the points, but also they have to do their persuasive speech in under 90 seconds. So they have to make sure that they are getting under that 90-second mark with their speech. And so this helps them to time themselves. This helps them to see exactly what they're saying, to indicate where they have pauses or where they want to keep going, and really helps them to be more prepared for those presentations. And another thing is, if you allow reassessment, which I do in my class, you can give students feedback using Mote. Again, I feel that students are going to be more likely, and I've actually proven this by surveying my students, students are much more likely to listen to feedback than they are to read written feedback. And so giving students feedback and then giving them that opportunity to listen to that feedback and then try again, whether that's a spoken feedback, whether that's students doing a speaking activity or a writing activity, giving them the feedback and allowing them to reassess is a great way to give them some ownership here. And I talked before about focused. Assessments should focus on 1 or 2 skills, max 3 at a time. And so I think it's really fun for students to be able to focus in on those skills and not feel like they have to do everything all at once. That way they'll get feedback on how they're doing on 1 or 2 things as opposed to all the things at once. And that's something that I think can be very powerful. You can also do a discussion-based assessment where students are speaking back and forth to each other. You can have students do a spoken Mote and then respond to somebody else's Mote. And that's a really fun option. They can they can listen to each other's and really listen with the intent of responding, which I think is something that's a really important life skill. So doing a discussion-based assessment can be really fun. A listening and speaking assessment, and I say both things intentionally, can also be really fun. So you would create some recordings, have students listen to that recording, and then have them do a spoken response to that. I would make a copy for each student. And maybe this could be one thing that they're listening to, but I could also do a series of things that students are listening to and then have them respond using Mote. That way you have that back and forth where they get the opportunity to listen. Another thing that's great is with a Mote, they can listen again. It's not just a kind of one and done situation, which is really helpful. So they listen. And again, the purpose of this is not just to assess their listening. I think also to make sure they listened with the point of speaking in return. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be a speaking assessment. You could do a listening assessment and then have students answer a series of questions based on that. Really just depends on what you want to do with your students. But I think it's really fun to do speaking and listening back and forth. Another thing as a language teacher I find helpful is having students summarize a passage. And I see here in the target language, but really, even if you're an English teacher or if you're a science teacher, having students summarize what's going on in a lab, have students summarize what's going on in an English passage. Maybe even if you're a math teacher, having students walk you through the steps, kind of walk and talk you through how they are approaching a problem can be something that's really helpful. So you can see how they're doing and give them appropriate feedback on that. So summarizing not just a passage, but all these different things can be helpful for students. Another thing that's fun is describing a picture. So giving students a picture and then having them describe what's going on. That could be in the target language. It doesn't even have to be a picture. It could be describe this diagram, describe this map, describe what's going on here. Maybe it's a series of pictures, describe how one leads into the other. There's a lot of different things you can do where students can each get something that they have to describe. And that's something that will give you an opportunity to listen to what they're doing. And I don't know about you, but it's so nice to just be able to put in my earbuds and be able to listen to student responses as opposed to reading all of them at the end of a busy day too. And so that's something that can be really helpful. Above all, the reason why I like to use Mote is it allows my students to have easy, quick feedback. And I think that's probably the most powerful thing of all. Because the whole point of assessment, like I've been saying, is it's a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop between a teacher and a student. And so for me, I always see it as, okay, this is something where I'm getting student work and then I have to do my part in this and give them feedback. And so I also ask students to reflect on their assessments. I ask them 3 questions. I say, what did you find success with? What did you find challenging? And what do you want your teacher to know? Just like I said at the beginning. And after every assessment, getting those 3 questions answered really helps me to gauge, okay, where are students? How are they doing? And what can I do better as a teacher? Because it's my job to lead students through this education process, educator to lead out in Latin. So I'm leading students through this process, and I want to be able to have an effective feedback loop so that I can get them where they need to go, and I get that feedback from them. And so one of the reasons I really like Mote is fast feedback. It takes me so much less time to just say the feedback rather than to type the feedback to each individual student. So as a teacher who's always looking for things to save time, Mote is an incredibly powerful tool for that. It's super easy to respond. The ease of use with Mote is amazing. Just clicking either on the extension in Chrome or using comments in different Google Docs or using forms is really, really helpful. It makes it very, very easy. It's also really easy to translate. So if I have students whose first language isn't English and I'm giving feedback in English, maybe they can translate to help them understand my feedback better. Because really the purpose of feedback is something that is comprehensible by the student and gives them action for moving forward. So if my students don't understand what that action is, that can be a problem. And so making it so that it's easy to translate is really, really helpful too. And I think that so often, if you type something, it can be really hard for students to kind of understand the tone. I know sometimes in the past, if I get an email, sometimes I'm not quite sure what someone's tone is or how they're feeling with it. And I think that when you hear someone's voice saying words, it makes a big difference because you can tell what kind of tone that is. And as teachers, we try to have a supportive tone. We try to help students like that. And I think that can be really reassuring to students when they're getting feedback on assessment, to hear the tone of voice and to hear that supportiveness. And again, like I've been saying before, students are more likely to listen than to read comments. I've had much greater success in having students understand comments and actually listen and understand comments after using Mote. And so I encourage you to try it and see how your students do with it, because I have found it to be extremely effective. And finally, save time. Reuse voice notes from Motebook. And so I do this when I am doing the same feedback over and over again for something. But also, if you're doing something like writing comments for students, you can do it with your voice in Mote and then transcribe it, and then you have a comment. So you can create a comment bank using voice notes as well. So that's something that can be really helpful. I hope you have gotten a lot of ideas from this session and you've been able to think through different ways you can use Mote. But I think really we can use this tool to help our students with assessment, and that's what's really cool about it.